everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the ADR Wellbeing Toolbox, held in conjunction with Kiev Arbitration Days. I'm Mandy Lee, the founder of R.E.A.L. The ADR Wellbeing Toolbox is a joint initiative by ARBalance, VIAC, and R.E.A.L, united by a shared goal to develop tools and help members of the dispute resolution community to protect and preserve their well-being. To date, we've explored numerous topics, including most recently imposter syndrome and how to overcome it. All our episodes are available on our YouTube channel. Now, in a moment, I'll hand the microphone to Kabir Duggal before introducing our guest speaker. But before I do, a few words on today's topic, compassion versus boundaries, emotional intelligence in the workplace. Now, emotional intelligence is the ability to recognize, understand, and manage your own emotions while also being attuned to the emotions of others. It's crucial for effective communication, empathy, and navigating complex social interactions. Now, a helpful way to visualize the interplay of emotions is through Pixar's Inside Out. For those unfamiliar, the heartstring yanking film is set inside the mind of an 11-year-old girl named Riley. Her emotions, joy, sadness, anger, fear, and disgust are personified as characters navigating her life's upheavals. Initially, Joy tries to suppress sadness, but she ultimately learns that sadness has a vital role to play in healing and growth. It's a reminder that emotional intelligence isn't about avoiding certain feelings, but understanding how they can work together. And this brings us to today's discussion, compassion versus boundaries. Supporting people in distress is not only a human imperative, but also a professional one. It's easy to say we must be compassionate, but it's harder to answer how much compassion is too much, or where do I draw the line? And this can be especially challenging in professional contexts such as arbitration, where neutrality and fairness are essential. Perhaps, however, compassion and boundaries are not in opposition. Perhaps instead they're complementary. Compassion without boundaries can lead to burnout for individuals and teams. On the other hand, boundaries without compassion can lead to coldness and isolation. True emotional intelligence lies at the intersection of these two concepts. I'll close with a line many of you may recognize from The Mandalorian. This is the way. The way is not always clear or easy, but there's strength in knowing we're committed to walking it. Supporting others during difficult moments requires each of us to find our way, one that's guided by both compassion and the wisdom to set boundaries. As you listen today, reflect on times in your own practice when compassion felt like a strength and when it felt like a weight. How can you achieve a better balance in the future? And on that note, I'll now turn the floor over to Kabir Duggal before I introduce Sara.
Thank you, Mandy, and thank you all for joining us, either live or virtually. Folks, one of the challenges we have as being a professional is that we juggle multiple roles. At any given point in time, we are many things at the same time. So we are professionals, lawyers, but we can also be parents, children, friends, colleagues. And when you come to the workplace, you often hear this statement, keep your professional life and your personal life separate. Can we really do that? And just to add an additional complexity, right? There can be external factors. We're talking in real time at the Kiev Arbitration Day, and a reality in Ukraine today is that there is an armed conflict, right? So you can have at any given moment so many different realities that a person is confronting. And then you get to the workplace, and this is the challenge that we encounter. How do we draw the line where you are a good supportive ally versus just being a real pain in the blank, right? That is the challenge that we all encounter, because we would like to be good supportive allies. We would like to be there for our friends and colleagues, but how do we do it in a manner that really helps the person that we intend to help? Don't overthink this issue, folks. We have a fantastic speaker, Sara Cook, who joins us today. And the topic that she's going to discuss, as Mandy alluded, is something that I think is really, really relevant to each of us. The topic is compassion versus boundaries, emotional intelligence in the workplace. This is something I have struggled with. And I think, sometimes in reflection, you can be there without saying things. So I really feel there's a lot for me to learn about. Very excited, Sarah. Thank you for joining us. Mandy, you have the difficult task to introduce our speaker. This is something I always struggle with because I think I can spend 60 minutes and still feel I haven't done justice to a person like Sarah. So you're going to have the challenge and the challenge to do that in 2 to 3 minutes. So let me pass the mic to you, Mandy, to introduce Sarah.
Thank you very much, Kabir. I'm delighted to have the pleasure and the privilege of introducing Sara Cook to you all today. Sara is a Belfast-based conflict response specialist with extensive experience supporting those affected by conflict in Northern Ireland and beyond. Her peace-building work includes mediation, dialogue, and storytelling encounters between conflict-affected groups, such as victims, survivors, security forces, and paramilitaries. Sara's work addresses the psychosocial impact of conflict, including its effects on mediation and peace-building practitioners. For 20 years, folks, for 20 years, she's designed methodologies to address conflict-related impact and provided training in mediation, dialogue, trauma intervention, and resiliency. She's trained people from over 50 countries, including humanitarian aid workers resettling refugees from Ukraine, Syria, and Afghanistan. Over the past 2 years, Sara's work with Ukrainian refugees has included training over 250 people in trauma-informed and resiliency-focused learning. We are extremely lucky to have her and the benefit of her insights with us today. And so, without further ado, Sara, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for that warm welcome. And thanks to Ema and Kabir for inviting me into this space. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today. I know many of us are joining from different parts of the world, and some of us will be listening after. So just want to extend a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us either now or in the future. So today, as you know, we're going to be really focusing on this question of compassion versus boundaries. So how can we really employ emotional intelligence in the workplace to support colleagues, but also to make sure that we are in a state of well-being ourselves? And this is a really key question in places like Ukraine, where people are experiencing armed conflict and the effects of that all the time. And many of you are joining from other parts of the world where there's political instability or where there's a number of crises that are affecting your communities and nations. And so that, of course, comes into the workplace. We spend as much time with our colleagues as we do our family members often. Sometimes we spend more time with our colleagues than we do with our friends and our social circles. So they're a big part of our lives. We care about the people that we work with, and we care about their well-being, but at the same time, they are colleagues. And so it's this really complex space sometimes that we need to navigate between being supportive when our colleagues have experienced loss or maybe experienced trauma or high levels of stress, but also maintaining those healthy boundaries that we need to employ in the workplace. So today we're going to talk about that really interesting space, that Venn diagram, if you will, that overlaps between our work responsibilities and our care for our colleagues, and a little bit around how we can make sure that we're experiencing well-being in the midst of all of that as well. So let's start with some conversation about emotional intelligence, just to establish that baseline, because a lot of us have heard of emotional intelligence, of course, but we're not always sure what that consists of. And Mandy gave us a wonderful definition in her introduction. But I want to add to that the definition of Mental Health America, which is a really simple definition, but I think very right on the nose. The ability to manage both your own emotions and to understand the emotions of people around you. Okay. And this is a kind of a journey that a lot of us are on, the different cultures that we're a part of, our different families of origin have different relationships to emotions. As an American who's spent half my life in Northern Ireland, I know this really to be true. You know, in the United States, we talk a lot about emotions. We would kind of engage other people in conversation about emotions. Whereas in Northern Ireland, particularly during the conflict here or just after, it was very unusual for people to move into that space of talking about how they were doing, and of course, inquiring about how other people were doing and really getting into the details of the emotional experience. So it's important to recognize that, you know, no matter where we are in the world, we're going to have a slightly different cultural relationship to excavating emotions within ourselves and being willing to discuss them with others. But emotional conversation can be important, and acknowledging emotions can be very important. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. So, how do we sort of think about ways to either enter into this in a deeper way for ourselves and others, or for those of us who might already be very open about examining our own emotions and others? How can we really be mindful of some of the key elements of emotional intelligence in relationship to the workplace? So you can see these 5 key elements here. Self-awareness is the first. Okay, so really important to be aware of our own emotional journeys, even if we're pardon me, even if we're not discussing them with others. How can we be more aware of what's happening within us? Okay, so taking those moments to pause, to really check in with ourselves. How am I doing? What's happening for me right now? And we're going to talk a little bit about some specific ways to do that in a moment. But it's important for us to take that time, especially when we're going through difficult periods of time, whether that be periods of just larger amounts of stress. You may have pressure at work. You may have things you're juggling at home in your personal life. And during those times, it's particularly important to stop and assess, how am I doing right now? What's happening with me? And what is that emotional journey like? And that's particularly important because when we're not doing that, that can spill over into our working lives very easily. So if we come to work really stressed, we might be shorter with our colleagues, we might snap at people, we might make some decisions more quickly than usual, and that often has outcomes in our work and our working relationship. So being mindful of our own experience, our own kind of emotional journey, our own emotional experience at any time, employing that self-awareness can be really important. Because if we realize, actually, I'm a little more fragile than I normally am, it can allow us to support ourselves and to be stronger in that workplace environment. Self-regulation is a big part of that. So some of us may have heard of self-regulation. We may not be entirely sure what that means. Self-regulation can refer to both our emotional journey and being able to regulate our emotions, and to regulate even our physiological response to those emotions. So if you find that you're kind of flying off the handle, you're quite angry because you've got a lot going on, you're very stressed, you might be angry about even the context of what you're experiencing in your country, whether that's politics or conflict. If you bring that anger into the workplace and you're not aware of it, you are not able to regulate, to be able to manage that anger, it's probably going to impact the people around you. So knowing how to regulate that emotion, being able to know how to settle yourself, to calm down is important. But it's also important because physiologically we experience sensations, physical sensations related to emotions. And so if our heart's racing and our shoulders are up and we're sweating and we're a little shaky, we're going to be bringing that into the workplace. We're going to be bringing that energy, that experience into our conversations and our engagements with colleagues. And so knowing how to actually physically regulate our nervous system, be able to experience that kind of balance in the body can be really important. So we're going to talk about that in a moment as well. Motivation is part of emotional intelligence. We really want to know how to be motivated, to look at our own emotional experience, to be able to kind of be curious about the emotional experience of the others around us. So for people who are emotionally intelligent or who are trying to cultivate their own emotional intelligence, they're likely to have that level of motivation. I want to know what's happening for me. I'm curious about the experience of my colleagues. Empathy, as you'd imagine, is also a big part of emotional intelligence. So it's that desire to really, again, understand the emotional experiences and journeys of our colleagues, and to be able to, when necessary, provide that support. So people who are empathetic aren't just, focused on getting the job done. They're also very curious and wanting to connect with the journeys of the people that they're working with and to be able to support them in appropriate ways. And of course, social skills are a big part of it. When you kind of can intuit that something is maybe not right with a colleague, or that they're having a hard time, having those social skills to know how to just say, hey, I know this is a busy time for you. I hope you're okay. Just wanting to let you know that you have my support. Okay, so those nice, easy social skills that some of us maybe have a little bit more of, either by nature or by nurture, and some of us have to cultivate a little bit more. But those social skills are really important when we think about emotional intelligence. So it's really these 5 key elements that are in play all of the time. So let's start to begin to think about when colleagues or when we are experiencing stress or trauma, how might that show up? What might we be looking for if we are going to be in the position of supporting a colleague who might have experienced trauma or loss? So there are some physical indicators of trauma, and that can include hypervigilance, that sense of being amped up all the time, kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, ready to respond to very difficult circumstances. When we've experienced a lot of stress or trauma, our bodies can kind of be on that hair trigger. They can be sort of really ready to anticipate difficult experiences. And that can feel like a pretty strong reaction in the body. Sometimes we experience sleeplessness or changes in our sleeping. We might feel just larger amounts of fatigue than usual, or related illnesses to fatigue. We might notice changes in our eating. So eating much less than usual, eating much more than usual, or digestive changes for us. We might experience physical pain in various parts of the body, or we might actually experience an increase in headaches if we're experiencing a lot of pain, a lot of trauma or stress. We also have those signs of nervous system activation in the body, those tighter muscles, the increased heart rate, the accelerated breathing, the sweating. All of those things can be very present for us when we're experiencing stress or indeed trauma. And if we experience it over a prolonged period of time, there can be larger scale health consequences. So we can experience, for example, higher rates of cancer or heart disease, etc., which is why it's important when we're experiencing stress or trauma to take that time to really support ourselves so that we can, or to get the support we need from others so that we can manage that experience for ourselves. Mentally, we may experience nightmares or flashbacks, reliving some difficult moments. There may be the perception of danger everywhere, even when we're doing okay. When we're physically in a safe environment, it may not feel like that. We may perceive much of our environment to be dangerous. We can experience the inability to concentrate when we're overwhelmed by stress or trauma. We might find it hard to make decisions, to focus, to remember details. We can also experience cyclical thinking, or our thoughts kind of run in a cycle, or distressing thoughts or images that are hard to put down. We can feel mentally very overwhelmed, again, finding it really hard to process the information that we might normally be processing, or again, to be able to ask questions of people, to be able to be in conversation the way we normally would, or to make decisions in the way that we normally would. We can also find that we experience anxiety or depression, or even guilt or shame. And for a lot of people that I've worked with in many, many places around the world, guilt and shame is quite big when they're going through loss or stress or trauma, because people often feel shame about the kind of reactions that they are experiencing. And so for me, that's one of the important things we'll talk about in just a moment, of just being very, being able to normalize some of these things, to know this is part of the human experience. When we go through difficult periods or adversity, we will experience some of these indicators. And it's not a sign that we are mentally weak. It's a sign that we're human beings and our bodies are responding in a very natural and normal way to adversity. Relationally and behaviorally, we also experience changes. So we might experience something like the inability to leave home or even isolating ourselves from social circumstances. We might notice changes in our relationship or relationship breakdowns, difficulties forming new attachments with people, lack of trust, lack of motivation at work or at home. We can turn to substances or become addicted to other things that might bring us comfort or help us feel better in the moment. And we even see things like intimate partner violence or family strain when people have gone through really large periods of stress, trauma, or loss. Now, that's not to say we're going to all experience all of these things. And I don't share them to depress us by any means, but to say these are really normal outcomes or reactions when we're going through difficult times. So we might see these in colleagues, or colleagues might be naming some of these changes for themselves when they're going through difficult periods. One of the best ways that we can provide support to colleagues or indeed other people in our lives when they're going through very, very difficult periods of loss or trauma is a combination of knowledge and nervous system regulation. Okay, so you see there, knowledge plus nervous system regulation equals better coping. And what I've discovered in my several decades of work with people who've experienced a lot of adversity or conflict or trauma is that most of us don't know what's happening to us in those moments, don't know how to make sense of what's happening for us emotionally or physically or relationally, because we're often not taught about it. Okay. So my background is social work, history, conflict response. And even in those related fields, there was never any conversation about what's normal in the body when we're experiencing difficult times or when indeed we're experiencing trauma. And I've worked all over the world with doctors and nurses, with psychologists, with police, with teachers, with educators, community leaders. And in all of these areas that are front facing to people who've experienced trauma or distress, very few of us have been trained specifically in understanding stress and trauma. Okay. And so one of the best gifts we can give to colleagues and others is just to have a little bit more knowledge in our toolbox about what's normal and to be able to reassure and normalize for people what they're experiencing. For those of us in ADR, that's particularly important because stress and trauma shows up at the mediation table. It shows up in negotiations. It shows up in arbitration because the very experience of conflict can be really distressing for people. So for us as practitioners, it's particularly important to know even the signs of stress or trauma and how they might show up at the table, so to speak. But we can also help colleagues and others feel safer or feel more in control in those moments where they're really overwhelmed by helping them know how to regulate their nervous system. For example, using just very simple well-being tools to begin to calm some of those stress responses in the body and to help them feel better in that moment. And again, to feel more in control. Because when we're really overwhelmed by experiences of stress or trauma in the body, we really can feel very out of control and quite helpless. And so this can be really helpful in people navigating their work environment and navigating their home environment when they're going through difficult periods. I'm not going to go over this, but this can be helpful as a tool. I'll send you all the slides afterwards. They'll be made available to people. Again, this sort of builds on the previous slide around stress and trauma response, but this can be helpful to have this slightly more expanded slide to kind of share with colleagues, particularly those of you who are living and working in Ukraine, to share what's very normal during these times. Because often when I'm working, particularly if I can be so bold as to say, men who might come from societies where stress and trauma aren't often shared, men will come up to me after trainings or in the break to say, I'm so glad you shared that. I had no idea that was normal. And I had no idea that I'm not the only one experiencing this. We just don't talk about it. So this can be a helpful tool in just reassuring colleagues this is normal when we go through this. It can also be helpful just to explain a little bit about the nervous system. I'm not going to go into great detail on this today because of our limited time, but it can be really useful for people to know that the autonomic nervous system is the part of our body that helps us survive. It helps us to employ survival responses, sometimes in what feels like an instant, to help us stay alive. Okay, so this is a finely tuned, very important part of human functioning. And there are two parts of the nervous system. One is called the sympathetic, and we can think of that almost as like an accelerator in a car. It helps us to gets us ready for action, helps us to respond almost in a moment to survive, to look after ourselves. Whereas the parasympathetic is almost like the brake of the nervous system. Once that moment of crisis is passed, it helps us get back into that normal level of functioning, helps us calm down and regulate, bring the body back into balance. And we're probably all very familiar with these sympathetic nervous system responses in the body that you can see here, because these happen when we're undergoing everyday stress, as well as when we're experiencing kind of a genuine threat or a crisis situation. So our breathing goes up, our heart rate increases, our muscles tighten or gather, our blood pressure increases, we sweat, our stress hormones elevate. And the biological reason for that is the body's trying to get extra strength to the arms and the legs, the major muscle groups, to help us fight or flee. Those survival responses we're also so familiar with. And so it's sending extra oxygen, extra energy, extra blood flow to those regions to give us that extra strength, okay? At the same time, it's suppressing those parts of our biological functioning that aren't needed in that moment of survival. So digestion, reproduction, immune system response, all that goes offline because it takes excess energy that the body doesn't want to employ, which is why for some of us, we can work 12 hours and realize, oh my goodness, I've skipped lunch and or dinner because I've been so focused on my work. My stress response is a little bit elevated and my digestion's gone offline. Didn't even realize I was hungry until I stopped, okay? Or why for some of us, if we get up to deliver a big speech, our mouth might go dry, or our stomach clenches, or we feel a little bit, that turmoil in the stomach because our digestion is affected. Now, thankfully, we have that parasympathetic nervous system that brings us back into balance. So we notice, taking those big deep breaths, we can feel the body re-regulating, we can feel our heart rate slow down after that period of stress has passed. We might get hungry. We might start to feel like, oh yeah, I'm coming back to myself. And that's the body coming back into balance. Now, what's important for us to know is this will always happen automatically, even if it takes quite a lot of time, but we can actually employ a little life hack. We can actually put the brake of the nervous system on for ourselves by sending signals to the body that actually we're okay in that moment. So whether it's that you have a big ADR, kind of engagement coming up, you've got a big mediation or negotiation, or maybe you're delivering that big speech, or you've got 50 emails and not enough time to respond to them. When you find that activation in the body, the heart rate going up, the shoulders going up, we can actually employ some tools and some strategies to bring about that regulation. We don't have time to get into the brain science right now, but that's what actually helps us think more clearly. When our nervous system is regulated, our prefrontal cortex or our thinking network of the brain is much more engaged. It goes offline when we're experiencing stress or trauma, and we can bring it back online by helping the body come back into balance. And so it's really important because it helps us feel better in those moments, to feel more in control, whether it's a genuine crisis or whether it's everyday stress. But it also helps us think more clearly, be able to make decisions more effectively, and to be able to engage with colleagues more effectively when we have our full capacity to think. And so this can be really important. You're curious, of course, about how we do this. How do we signal the nervous system? How do we bring the body back into balance? And we don't have time to go into the details of this today, but the headline on this is that we want to employ sensation. We want to help the body actually feel that we're not under threat. And the quickest way to do that, neuroscientists are finding, is not through self-talk, which is what most of us do. It's okay, calm down, I'll be just fine. We want to actually do it through sensation, signaling to the body that actually I'm feeling a little bit better right now. So one of the ways we can understand this is through the triangle of well-being. We're used to thinking thoughts to help ourselves feel better. We might take a moment during a stressful day to think about someone or something that really helps us get through difficult times. We might have certain emotions that we turn towards. We're experiencing love or joy or happiness. We feel better in the body. So both of those parts of the triangle are critical. But what we want to start to do is bring sensations into play. when we're thinking about that person or that part of our life that brings us joy, or when we're experiencing those emotions of love or gratitude, we want to also notice where that shows up in the body. Okay. Do we take a nice deep breath? Do the shoulders come down? Does that tension in the jaw release a little? Do we feel warm in our chest or our stomach as we think about that lovely moment or that person that we appreciate, or the pride that we take in our work? Okay. So the principle behind this is when we can just start to notice those sensations connected to well-being in the body, we get that lovely state of inner balance, that regulation in the nervous system. And the beautiful thing that research is showing us now is that the more we can focus our attention on sensations of well-being in the body, the more that those will grow. Okay. So it's like a lovely biological feedback loop that will increase. So if we notice that nice breath, often we'll find, oh, we're taking another one, or oh, the shoulders drop, or we start to feel better in the body. And as simple as that is, it's extremely profound for people who are living through crisis. I'll talk about this briefly at the end, but we've been using this in Ukraine since the first week of the war. And we have a number of people who are practitioners, teachers throughout Ukraine, over 50 people who are supporting their colleagues with these skills, their family, children in school throughout Ukraine. And people are saying the war is getting worse, but I feel more in control. I'm feeling better in my body because I can manage my stress response or my trauma response in relation to this. So it's simple but profound. And I'm sharing a resource here for you where a lot of this information is available. It's called the R.E.A.L app, and you can find it in Ukrainian, English, Arabic, Hebrew, and a number of other languages, where people can start to learn some basic skills that can help to regulate the nervous system. So this is something you can share with colleagues that helps you set that boundary. They can take it home and learn it for themselves, but you can share some helpful advice that's very practical, very scientific, very neurobiological, that can help them in those moments. And it's important to say that all of the techniques that you'll find on this app are designed to be used in the moment. So you don't have to wait till you're at home. You don't have to wait until you're out of a stressful environment. They can be used at the ADR table. They can be used in a tough moment at work to get through and to find a little bit of that balance and that control in the midst of difficult circumstances or moments where we're experiencing those stress reactions more strongly. So how do we create boundaries beyond maybe sharing some knowledge with colleagues around what can be normal and expected when they're going through periods of crisis, or helping to share some of those concepts about self-regulation that can be really useful? We can actually work to create boundaries if colleagues want to share some of what's happening with them, but we want to make sure not only that they're safer as they share, but that we're safer, that we don't take a huge amount of what they're experiencing onto us. So if someone wants to talk to you, we can start to create a boundary by saying, you can tell me as much or as little about what happened to you as you would like. So often in many cultures around the world now, we almost feel like we have to share our story of distress or adversity to actually feel better. And while that can be helpful for some people, others may kind of get hijacked by that story. They may start to share about what's happening and find that they're reliving it as they tell you. And so just beginning, I'm really happy to listen to you right now, but you need to know I'm happy to support you no matter how much you tell me. So you can tell me as much or as little as you'd like. You can also invite this person to start with whatever they want to tell you in the present moment and work backwards. As simple as that sounds, I've worked with thousands of people around the world who sometimes want to share the story of what they're experiencing. But when they start at the moment of crisis and work forward, it's much more likely that they become overwhelmed by the details of that experience and may be more inclined to relive it as they're telling it. When they start in the present, it gives them that sense of security and safety. They're here with you. You're at work. They're okay. And they're going to choose maybe more strategically, unconsciously, of what they want to touch on, working backwards, instead of becoming overwhelmed by that story. If someone's also sharing with you something that's really difficult for them, you can gently ask them about the survival elements of that story, or you can focus on strengths-based questions. I was working during lockdown with a wonderful individual online and a university class, and this individual was there to share about their story of overcoming some very difficult things. But like many of us do, as they were sharing their story, even though they've done it many, many times, they really became overwhelmed by some of those details of the experience. And then when the students asked questions after, they inadvertently asked questions that really increased that distress. Oh, that sounds terrible. Like, did anybody support you? How did you deal with that? And this person became, visibly more and more distressed. So I paused and I said, I just want to pause the questions for a moment. You've gone through very difficult things, but actually you've helped so many people through that experience. You've had so much strength in your life since then. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And immediately, his facial expression changed, his posture changed, his body language changed, and you could see that regulation, that balance in the body, in the nervous system. And then he was able to re-engage from a place not of distress, but of strength. So we can do that for colleagues, or we can create resiliency pauses. If people become really visibly distressed, you might want to use some of the well-being skills that you can check out after our time together to just help them feel a little calmer, and then they can return to the story. So we want to be sharing, if people are sharing about difficult circumstances, from that place of balance and strength whenever possible. Some of you may be saying, well, how do I do that? What questions do I ask? When we want to employ that strengths-based support, we can just, whenever possible, we can move the conversation in that direction by asking those strengths-based questions. So, for example, if someone has gone through a crisis, whether that's war or conflict related or otherwise, you might say, can you tell me the moment you knew you'd survived? Okay. For some people that I've worked with in Ukraine over the last 2.5, 3 years, people find great relief in saying, oh, well, I knew I'd survive when this happened, or when I saw my partner, coming through the crowd, when the ambulance arrived. And knowing that they're able to kind of talk about that can create a real sense of well-being in the body. Can you tell me the moment help arrived? Who or what's helping you the most now? What's helping you get through when things are difficult? Talking about these factors, these strengths-based elements of our lives can be incredibly helpful for people. But sometimes we know colleagues have experienced loss, and it's okay for us, if we feel comfortable, to invite them to explore some of the beautiful parts of that person or their lives. Often when someone loses a loved one, they want to talk about it, but we're just not sure, as people who support them, how to make that possible or whether it's appropriate. But this can be a wonderful way to boundary conversations and keep them safer, where you might say, can you tell me some really meaningful memories of her or him? Or what did you like to do together? What kind of things did you do, or what were they like? Tell me more about who they were or their personality. You might even say, what kind of things would they say to you now to encourage you, to keep you going? Or what did they say to you during their life that really, comforted you when you were going through difficult moments? So being able to talk about these strengths-based elements of the people that they loved can be so helpful in the case of someone's loss. And the key for us in offering this strengths-based support is it keeps it safer for the person who's talking, because they're less likely to venture into details that are associated with trauma, or to go into those details for themselves. But it also allows us to be able to listen without reliving some of those difficult details with them as well. And so it keeps it safer, and it also can create that real sense of strength for the individual that we're supporting. It can also be helpful to help colleagues look for signs of post-traumatic growth. So this is a really interesting area of study that was carried out by a researcher called Tedeschi and his colleagues in the mid to late 90s. And their research showed that as many as 90% of victims and survivors of difficult experiences report at least one indicator of post-traumatic growth. So that can be a sense of increased resilience, internal strength, that sense of gratitude for life, becoming a stronger advocate, appreciating our loved ones. I'll let you take a look at some of the others. But these factors exist for many of us, even after we've experienced trauma or extreme adversity. And so we often miss them in ourselves or others because of what scientists call the negativity bias. Because humans are built for survival, we're very good at categorizing difficult experiences and remembering them. In fact, the brain actually stores memory associated with difficulty or loss in a different way because it wants us to be able to protect ourselves and to act with even more clarity in the future. But what that means is it means we really lean into unpleasant experiences, okay? And we often miss those really beautiful things in life, including signs that we've grown after difficulty, because those things don't help us to survive. And so we have to be a little bit more mindful of those and focus on those. So if you see this in colleagues, you might say, I know this has been a really difficult time for you or for all of us on our working team, but I want you to know I'm seeing these ways that you're really thriving, or these ways that you're growing after that, or these signs of resilience in your life. We can look for them for ourselves as well, of course, and we should be. But this is a gift we can give our colleagues that they may have missed and that may really increase their ability to cope. And we do this in a really nicely boundaried way. When we're mentioning experiences that we see or indicators that we see of post traumatic growth, it means people aren't going back into the trauma, but they're able to hold the trauma with the resilience. So sometimes we might look kind of simply refer to that as what else is true. When we're going through periods of stress or adversity or loss, of course that's true. We don't pretend it's not. But what are those other factors in our lives that we often lose sight of that can really help us hold that intention or hold that in balance? Who are the people that are supporting us? What are the ways we're making it through? What are those ways that we're growing despite this loss? And thinking of those things, recognizing them, naming them, can help us hold some of the difficulty and balance for ourselves. One of the things we want to be mindful of is just the risk of secondary trauma when we are working with, as people in Ukraine are, people who are affected by the conflict there, by the war, and or when we're walking alongside of colleagues when they're going through difficult things. So secondary trauma just simply means personal impact that comes from the prolonged exposure to the trauma of others. And sometimes we call this compassion fatigue, sometimes it's called vicarious trauma, but it all means the same thing. It means that we are at risk when we support others who've experienced difficult things of just having some of that impact ourselves. And that's because humans are built for empathy. We're built to come alongside of each other. So, of course, we experience a little of what our loved ones or our colleagues might experience. And so just want to encourage us, I'll let you look at the rest of this slide yourselves, but just want to encourage us to sometimes recognize that this is normal. It's normal for all of us who either are in the helping professions or who journey alongside of people who've experienced trauma, including ADR professionals. So I'm doing a lot of work at the moment on trauma-informed mediation, trauma-informed negotiation, because those of us that deal with conflict are dealing with adversity all the time. And it's really normal to experience a little bit of impact ourselves when we support others. So what we can do to minimize this is we can support colleagues in this boundaried fashion that we've talked about, but we can also use wellness skills and that kind of awareness for ourselves of how we're doing to be able to support ourselves and to minimize the risk of secondary trauma. So I want to encourage us not only to look after our colleagues, but also to look after ourselves. So we all know this picture of the oxygen mask in the plane. When we have that turbulence, of course, those masks drop down. And if we don't take a moment to secure our own mask, it means we don't have the capacity, the literal oxygen to support the people next to us that need our support. And this is true in life as well. So many of us get used to looking after everybody around us, and we give ourselves whatever's left, if anything. And actually, it's incredibly important, particularly for those of us living and working in environments like Ukraine or other places in the world that are experiencing conflict, to really take that moment, maybe every day, to look after ourselves, to kind of engage that emotional intelligence and check in. How am I emotionally? What's going on in my body? Do I have those signs of stress that I'm experiencing? And how can I use some well-being tools to bring about that regulation, to bring about that balance before I go into the office and begin to engage with people, or during a difficult meeting, or during a moment during the day when it's intense, or as I support a colleague or after I support a colleague, to check in on myself. How am I feeling? That was an important conversation, but quite heavy. So what's going on for me? And to be able to take that moment to put on our oxygen mask before we send the next email, before we make the next phone call, before we send the next text, just pausing, even for a minute, 2 minutes to check in. How am I doing? And is there something I can do to support my nervous system, to support myself emotionally in this moment before I resume my day? And that's incredibly important for those of us who are ADR professionals. We can do this before, during, and after a mediation, negotiation, arbitration, but also as we support colleagues in environments where they may be experiencing stress, loss, or trauma. So as I prepare to finish today, I want to just share very briefly that we've been, as I mentioned, doing this in Ukraine since the start of the war. So initially, it was an international team that came together to support people with free online support spaces that people were accessing, via Zoom, via Facebook, even while sheltering in those first few days and weeks of the war. And tens of thousands of people access that support. So very basic ways to regulate the nervous system, from bomb shelters, from other very difficult experiences during those initial weeks and months. And then what we shifted to was, of course, equipping people in Ukraine to do it themselves. They did not need a bunch of people coming in from the rest of the world. They could do this with their own resiliency and resources there. And so we worked with people to spread some of this information and these experiences. So we taught well-being tools to 246 support workers who are operating in Ukraine, Hungary, and Romania, with displaced people, with refugees, and with Ukrainians who were not displaced, but who were really suffering from the experiences of the war. And we also, in addition to that, taught another 50 plus people who would be trainers in supporting other people in even more intensive ways throughout the country. And what was amazing is that people, as I mentioned earlier, began to really notice that change using very, very simple well-being tools to soothe the nervous system, to send those kind of, if you will, sensation signals that they were safe and okay in that moment. People really began to notice they had more control, they were able to cope better over a longer period of time. And it also helped those people engaging with and supporting Ukrainians to know how to manage secondary trauma. So you'll see on this final point here, people said to me, please tell us, how do I manage secondary trauma? How do I prevent distressing thoughts and images? How do we emotionally recover after hearing trauma stories from colleagues or the people we support through our work? Or how do we support people in the moment if they're having a strong stress or trauma response with us? How do we, as non-clinical practitioners, we're not psychotherapists, we're not counselors, how do us, all of us who are normal people trying to operate in abnormal circumstances or extraordinary circumstances, how do we support colleagues and friends? And it was amazing how people said that after a little bit more knowledge, some experiences of well-being tools that they could put in their toolbox, how things really began to change for them, for their colleagues, and for the people that they supported through their work. So the good news, that the headline story, I suppose, in this is that we can't take away our colleagues' grief or pain, but what we can begin to do is support them in boundaried ways and help them with reference points for themselves of skills and tools and knowledge that they can use to help support themselves on a daily basis. But I will leave my email address here if people want to get in touch. Unfortunately, because of our time, we've only been able to brush across some of the information that can be useful and some of the tools that can be useful. But I'm more than happy if people would like more resources or, again, training or support for your teams to be in conversation about that. So please do feel free to be in touch if that's helpful to you all. So I'm going to pass it back to the organizing team now to facilitate our time together.
Thank you so much, Sara. This was very informative. And I really like that you included some very particular examples of, for example, of questions of how we can really step into support in those very important moments. So you have addressed the flight or fight responses, right? What happens in the freeze response, and how do we get out of that one?
That's a really interesting question. And Ima, it's particularly interesting because people in Ukraine have shared with me that, in the case, for example, of a colleague who I was training, it's important to say everyone was safe in this example before I give it. But she was queuing for groceries at the start of the war, and quite a large bomb dropped beside the queue. everyone was safe, but she said, I was shocked. None of us ran. Like we all froze. And that was really surprising to me. So this is one of the survival responses that can be really common as well. And I'm actually going to show you a slide that might be useful in understanding this. So we have, I'm just going to share this now. We have what we might deem to be the resilient zone for a lot of us, that kind of area where we're coping pretty well. And we can be up and down. We can be experiencing very stressful events, but we're still in control. We're still able to cope. And then we have particular events or triggers that for whatever reason, whether it's everyday life things or much more what we might call traumatic experiences, they really push or bump us out of that resilient zone. And when we go up out of that resilient zone, it's like fight or flight. That's when we get edgy or angry or experience anxiety or panic, or get really angry and can't control what we're saying to others. But what you're alluding to is the low zone, which is another way of understanding the freeze response. And that's when we might feel really depressed and sad. That's maybe when we feel really isolated, or we isolate ourselves. We can feel really overwhelmed by exhaustion or fatigue, or even just feel numb emotionally or physically. And those are all kind of freeze responses. And so for people who are living through very difficult circumstances, as people are in Ukraine, the low zone response is something that people often don't notice because it's not as clear or visible, but it's very common. So people might feel physically cold. People might feel really checked out of life. People might feel kind of unmotivated. So it can range from those experiences to actually not being able to physically move or to verbally speak. And that can be really normal. So it's important for us to know, as arbitrators, mediators, negotiators in the ADR world, that these things can happen at the table as well. So we can really notice. You might have a party that suddenly is, shouting and kind of going on, and you're going, whoa, where did that come from? Or someone becomes very anxious, or someone who is engaged in the process suddenly becomes very quiet and withdrawn. That can be a sign that they're experiencing freeze. And so our goal is, as ADR professionals, is to keep an eye out for that, to know what we're looking for, and to be able to support the parties back into the resilient zone so they can more equitably engage in the process, whatever that process of ADR is. It's also important for us as practitioners to know that nervous systems read each other. They're in conversation. So if we're around a table and it's kicking off, as we say in Ireland, with the parties, they're all flying into the high zone, it's going to be normal for us to experience, at bare minimum, maybe an elevated heart rate or stomach clenching, or those physiological signs in the body that we're actually experiencing a little of what they're experiencing. So this is why it can be really helpful to know self-regulation tools and skills so that we can support the parties, but we can support ourselves as well when we're really noticing those impacts. So I appreciate you asking about freeze, because that is one of the more common survival responses, and one that we often don't look for in ourselves or others.
Thank you. And now that we are slowly coming to an end, Mandy, I'm giving the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, Ima. Well, let me just take this opportunity to once again thank Sara very much for taking the time to join us today. I think that we have all learned some very practical lessons about ways in which we can better support others who are dealing with difficult times, and indeed better manage our own stress and our own trauma. So please do make sure that you check out Sara's website. And if you need to ask her anything that you don't wish to ask during our session today, which I appreciate, you might have a question on this topic that you would prefer to discuss with Sara privately, she has kindly shared her email address with us all. So thank you very much to everybody once again for joining us for this, the latest edition of the ADR Wellbeing Toolbox. We look forward to bringing you more insights to help you improve and preserve your well-being in 2025. And we're very grateful to everybody who has participated during 2024. So we look forward to seeing you next year, and we look forward to talking to Sara again in the future, we hope. So thank you all very much.